Yeah, good evening for you. Good afternoon from Paris. It's a pleasure to meet you again. I hope you are doing well and that the situation is better in Vietnam. I understand that you can move outside right now, so it's improving. Anyway, take care and take care to your family, in particular to the parents, grandparents. They have more risk than you. So today we start with the first session of this company evaluation course. And as you see on my slide here, I hope you see my slide. First, we'll say a few words on the syllabus in order you understand what our goals, what we're going to do, and how you are expected, to make your assignments and your final exam. Second, we move to the concept evaluation. What does it mean? What are we looking for? What are the main tools, methods? Third, have a look to specific points and basic rules. 4, we'll calculate some cost of debts, WACC, without leasing, with leasing, without taxes, with taxes, and so on. And take into account also the dividend approach, the Gordon-Shapiro model. And we'll integrate again the price earning method to make a simple calculation. So this is for today. Next time it means tomorrow on Tuesday, on Wednesday, and on Thursday. We have 4 sessions there. And during these sessions, we will start with next session with more complex situation in terms of model, like the leverage model, like introduction of market to book value ratio, you have already heard of. We will have a look with more details on the impact of specific financial resources, like derivatives, like leasing, like convertible bonds, or also preferred shares. On the third session, we will try to move from investment analysis to financial plan and valuation. It means we come back, in fact, to biotechnology. Say a few words of a small exercise on debt capacity, multiples, and we will introduce another case with biotechnology, and the other case is what we call ESD for electrical signal data. Session 4, we will go further into the leverage impact and on the costs, on the WACC, and of course on the value. And we'll make some calculations in a simple M&A exercise case in order to identify the value of both the target and the bidder. And last session will be mainly with your presentation and a few slides of conclusion. These presentation will be mainly on biotechnology and on electrical signal data. So that's for the content. And now let's have a look to the syllabus. And in that syllabus, we will check if you are able to design a financial policy, which is very central. We studied already that topic in the preceding course in diagnosis and financial policy, but we have to go into more details here in order to measure the impact of the financial policies on the value of a firm. You should also acquire here good knowledge of the evaluation tools and methods. And we present today a very simple slide with the main families in order methods, which are connected one with the other, are clear for you. You should be able also to compare different financial choices and policies, as well as the financial and valuation consequences of various strategies of the firms. So we will connect the strategies to the financial policy and to the valuation process and the value and the price at the end, which is accepted in the financial operation. Course content, it's a 5-session course, as you know. You are all together, Hanoi and Northern City students, for the 4th session, and we have the 2 groups for the last session next week. This means we have 4 sessions this week, and you have time to prepare your oral presentation for the last session, or part of it at least. I will come back on that point. Reading material, it's mainly, you know, again, Burke and DeMarzo. You can concentrate on chapter 19. Chapter 19 is a very good chapter on valuation and financial modeling with a case study there, you know, and we show you how to use comparables. Also, we come back on how to design a business plan, financial model, estimating the cost of capital, valuing the investments, you know, make a sensitivity analysis, and introduce all these elements, of course, in the valuation process. It's a very good chapter with a good example, and I suggest that you read this chapter very carefully. And you have my slides, of course, and a few past exams I will distribute for the tomorrow course. As usual, the final grade is made of a weighted average of 2 different elements. The first one is a final individual exam. It's a classical exam, 2 hours without documents and computers, 60% of the final grade, and homeworks on biotechnology and CSE case per group of probably 2 students. I say probably. I do not know the number of students taking the course, but I think we are 43, so probably I have to extend to 3 students per group. I will tell you this tomorrow. So that's the global presentation of the syllabus. Now, I will not come into detail on the exams. I will use questions in the next session, so we will go into the details. Anyway, the final exam will be very close to the preceding exams in financial analysis and in diagnosis and financial policy. There are 2 hours exam, there without documents and computers, and each exam is a kind of mix of questions and exercises. That means you have independent parts. Generally, it's about 5, sometimes 6, you know, and most of the cases, it's when it is 6, it's 4 parts with questions. Generally, in most of them, you have a choice, and you have to use short exercises. So that means if you don't understand the questions in one part, you can move to the next part without using the time available. So that's for the global organization. And I think that now we can start with the presentation of the topics today. Introduction to the course and the syllabus is just what we did. A few words on the final exam and assignments. I will come back anyway on that. Third point, evaluation: why, who, and how. 4 the main families of methods. 0.5 specific points. 0.6 basic principles and exercise in 0.7, and the main models in 0.8. That's enough for today. So for the assignment, back here, let's say, for the assignment, so it's a group assignment with biotechnology case and the CSE case. I'm waiting for short presentation. I mean, 10, 50 minutes, no more, okay? And each group will receive additional material in order that situations could be a bit different from one group to the other. It's something very classical with a PowerPoint presentation. So it means when you have 10 or 15 minutes, it's something that which is no more than 15 slides, perhaps better with 12 slides, you know. It means you have to go straight to the points, to the question raised, and try to develop your method and present your results. So this is what will be what I will be waiting for. And we will go into a detail tomorrow. So now, if I move to slide 4, and the question is, who is dealing with valuation? What about valuation? You know, and what you find is different players are looking for values. Analysts, of course, analysts in banking, in banks or insurance companies, for example. Investors. It could be institutional investors, it could be investment funds, it could be individual investors. CFOs are also very interested in the value of their company because the value of the company has an impact on their financial policy. And you understand that the tax administration could be also interested by the value of the company. But in some countries, at least, part of the taxes are based on the values of the assets and the values of the company as a whole. So the first idea is that many different players in the financial field are interested in valuation. But if you try to think to their main goals, they are very often different. Banking analysts are looking in priority, particularly in retail banks. They are looking for risk. They are lending to companies, mainly to small and medium-sized companies, and they are more interested by the risk, liquidity, solvency risk than by anything else. Of course, they are also interested by return, but probably the return, and that's what all the studies show, are the second goal, not the first one. Investors, it depends on their profile, if they are risk averter or if they are if they like risky operation. So investors are interested by both measures, but you can find different profile in terms of interest. They can also be interested in a value in the short term, and some others are interested by long-term values. They are long-term investors, stay 4, 5, 6, 10 years sometimes, and short-term investors can stay a very limited number of months, for example. So their calculations and their methods will be different. The difficulties also to make the calculations will be different. Why are CFOs so interested in value? Why do they like to increase the value of their company. First, of course, because they have to take into account the goals of the shareholders, and the shareholders are, of course, interested by the value of the company, by the increase in the value of the company, because they own part of the company with their shares. So their connection of their relation with the shareholders is at least partly based on the increase, recurrent increase of the value of the company. Second, when a company has a high value or increases value, it means also that if the CFO wants to issue new equity, new shares, the shares will be issued at a higher price if you compare to a case the company has a lower value. So that means it's easier to attract new investors with the same percentage of shares which are issued. The company obtains a larger amount of cash. Okay, so if they do that, this also has consequences in terms of cash, but consequences also in terms of debt equity ratio and in terms of risk. CFOs also are interested by high value and increase in value because they understand that high value is a kind of hedging policy against hostile takeovers. If you are overvalued, it becomes difficult for potential acquirers to obtain a good return on the deal if they buy the company. So high values, increase in values, overvaluations are protection against that kind of risk, the risk to be bought by a bidder. And the tax administration, of course, particularly when you have taxes, the transmission of companies between generations are interested in high values. So many different players in different situations are interested in valuations, and very often they like high value firms. Second, why to calculate values? If you go back to specific situation, of course, it is to find the price. And we'll come back on that point. It is clear that value is not a price. And that we can calculate several values using several methods. But also at the end, when there is a financial operation, we need one price. So the connection between the value and the price, which is one of the most interesting questions in economics and finance, will be studied here. To find the price, you need a price, for example, to make an IPO. You need a price in the privatization process. You need a price because you want to calculate a parity in a merger. You need a price for tax calculation basis. Has a tax calculation basis. So you find many circumstances, in financial business, where you need a price. And to obtain a price, you should first obtain values. Now, what kind of values are we interested in? And you can say we have at least three kinds of values we are interested in. First one is a book value, of course. and book values are calculated through methods applied to the balance sheet and the income statement. You need also market values, because transactions are made on the basis of market values, not on book values. Mm-hmm. And you need also replacement values. Replacement values means if you shut down the plant or company one with another and you want to start again scratch, what will be the cost to replace the preceding company? It's of interest, for example, for insurance companies. They bring some kind of hedging against fire, for example. Okay? So if your building, your headquarters, and your main plant are destroyed, what you need is to be insured against this situation. It means to get from your insurance company an amount of cash which is equal to the amount necessary to replace the destroyed building and factory. So replacement values are quite important also. Replacement values are also interesting, when you have a look to undervalued companies. Have a look to the airlines today. A large percentage of the airlines are undervalued because of the pandemic. But if you decide to shut down one of them, if you decide to shut down Vietnam Airlines or Air France KLM or Delta or another, you will understand that if you want to replace the assets, the level of cash which is needed is much higher than the value of a company right now in terms of market value or book value. That means in some cases, replacement values should be calculated using the values, market values of the different assets on the secondary market. And what you find, of course, is that replacement values of airlines today are much higher than their book value and than their market value. We will use different methods. And the methods to be used are based on different hypotheses with different data. Which means, when you calculate a value using one method, based, for example, on book value, and another one based on market value, and you use a model integrating a beta or integrating a terminal value, you will never find the same data exactly. You will find different values. So we will use different methods and we will get different values. And one of the question, of course, will be how to use these different values to get only one price at the end. We will see that in details in one of the cases we go through, which is called electrical signal data, ESD. So, out of this presentation of the problems, this sum of problems we meet, let's have a look to the main families. What are the main families of methods? So, first category is based on financial accounts, balance sheets, and income statements. Of course, in the balance sheet, after several marginal modifications or improvements, you get the value, a book value, which is equal to the total equity level. If you use income statements, you will be able to find values, different values also, using multiples, benchmarks. It means you need multiples. And the question is not so easy because to use multiples, you need comparables, you need similar companies, you need what we call benchmarks, either listed or non-listed. We come back on that point. And the difference, of course, between listed and unlisted company is a question of liquidity. Sometimes you have to use comparables coming in other countries because you are in a specific market and there's no real comparable in your own country, and you need to find a comparable outside. That means it's a different environment, different rules, sometimes different accounting system, become different legal background, which means there is a bias, if you compare to your own country, and you have to take into account this bias into evaluation. So income statements, even with something which seems to be very easy to go through, multiples, we can meet some difficult questions to take into account the differences in the different environments. We will use, of course, here the EBIT, the EBITDA, and what you call the operating earnings or net earnings, to calculate values. This is what you find in point 2, in fact, using benchmark and similar companies. And the question is, how many similar companies, how many benchmarks you need? Only one? Several different ones? Very often they are not completely comparable, but you have no other choice. So very often if it is possible, we use 3 or 4 different companies as benchmarks, and we make averages of other multiples. It's how it works. It is clear that there is a bias, you have bias, but there is no other way to go for that kind of problem. You can also use forecasts, and this is very well demonstrated in chapter 19, Burke and Demars. Free cash flows, I will show you the Sanofi case. And it can be based completely on free cash flows, the calculation of a table of free cash flows, and then using a capital asset pricing model to find the cost of equity. You calculate the weighted average cost of the funds, the WACC, and you make a calculation to discount the free cash flows you have found. The problem you find, and we have this problem to solve, is what about, the end of the calculation? I mean, even in cases like the pharmaceutical sector, which is relatively stable as a sector, you can design cash flow forecasts on a few years, sometimes 4, 5, 6, and you will see that in the model I will present you, it will be on 10 years. But after that, what about the cash flows after year 10? Because they are supposed to be introduced in the calculation of the value. And of course, we don't know how to make the calculation because it's too difficult to make a forecast of the free cash flows of the company in 15 years from now. So we need there what we call a terminal value calculation. So we have to go through that point, which is the only way to solve this difficulty. It could be also based, this forecast, not on the free cash flow, but on the dividend policies. And we see the main models using dividend policy, CDA and Gordon and Shapiro. And we will meet the same question, what about dividends in 15 years from now? But it's easier to manage in terms of calculation, in terms of mathematics, because we have convergence algorithm, which allow us under certain conditions to solve the problem. So to summarize it, we can also use forecasts, and forecasts are forecasts of cash flows, forecasts of dividends. We have got a problem of terminal value, of convergence, and we have to try to see what's happened with different data. It is clear that when we have a regular trend of growth of the dividends or free cash flow, it's much easier than in a situation they are not stable, they are volatile. And we have less bias in the method, the application of the method. And the fourth one is replacement approach. And replacement approach is mainly used by insurance companies because what they have to pay, if there is a fire, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's a replacement value of the company, of the factory, of the headquarters, and so on. So insurance models of valuation are based on replacement approach, and the calculation of the premium to be paid by the insured companies is based on these models. So it's a different approach. It's not the approach of the CFO. It's not the approach of an investor. It's not the approach of a retail banker. So we have different families which are issued from the goals of the different players involved in the valuation processes. A few specific parts. So I try to go with you here into a few specific parts. These points, are very important to understand and to take into account in the models. The first one is liquidity. Liquidity level is part of the value of a company. It means simply if when you buy a share of a company, if it is easy for you to resell a share a few days or a few months or a few years after, it is clear that you will buy more easily the share. So the liquidity of a share on the market, is a kind of asset which influence the potential shareholder. The higher the liquidity level, the higher the number of potential shareholder is. Okay. So that means if you have more shareholder with the same amount of shares to be sold available in the market, the translation of the consequence will be an increase in value. So liquidity level is part of the value. The higher the liquidity, the higher the premium on the basis of the calculation of the value. We have many studies on that available on different countries, different markets, and for long period of times. It's easy even to find in some journals, financial journals, studies made 30 years ago. And it is clear that all the results obtained through empirical research converge. And the convergence is on an increase in the price on the market when the level of liquidity is high. So liquidity has a value. The difficulty you find when you want to compare is that this premium is different from time to time, from one period to the other in the same country, the same kind of firm, and also is different from one country to the other. And you get differences which are due to culture, which are due to tax rules also. But anyway, you have a kind of premium always for liquidity. And for example, this is an element we have to take into account when we make calculation based on listed company, and you want to find a value for a company which is not listed. It means, of course, if a company you want to find a value to is not listed, then you use multiples coming from a listed company, you have to deduct this premium from liquidity. And you understand also, last point on liquidity, that for CFO, the liquidity explanation, is positive argument for a CFO to forecast an IPO in the next periods. He knows that if there is an IPO, or at least after a period which is a kind of apprenticeship on the market, the price of a share will increase, taking into account this liquidity premium. The second one is volatility. Can we say that the volatility level of a share is part of the value of a company? What again, we find from empirical research. Empirical research is very often the best basis to understand what's happened, and particularly in values calculation. And volatility is instability. It means simply, if the price of a share on the market is moving from 100 to 120 instead of a traditional 100 to 105 each day. It's at the same time an opportunity for some categories of shareholders, those trying to catch these differences in the same day. That's what we call day trader. And it's a risk for all the other, and we perceive this instability as a kind of unknown situation, unknown future for the company. So there is a decrease in the value. So generally what we see is that day traders are a minority of investors, and that when the volatility level of a share is high, there is a decrease in the value of a company. If you have a look to the stock markets today in the world, you will understand that the market were really bullish for months, that now we calculate the average in a few weeks is relatively stable, but we have also an increase in volatility, which explains partly the fact that the markets are not going up as they did in the last between April and and August. So the volatility level is a risk measure. The liquidity level is a positive, has a positive impact on the value. Third point, equity for free and signal theory. Remember probably what we did in the last course. Remember that equity for free issues, according to the calculations, they don't bring any value. The value of the company at the end is equal to what it was at the beginning, before the issue. And if you come back to the balance sheet, you understand that the only modification is inside the total equity with a translation of retained earnings to equity. But in fact, when you have a look again at the result of financial research, you understand that in most of the cases, equity for free issues bring an increase in the price. Or it's not a very important increase. It can be 2, 3, 4%, 5 sometimes. And we explained that clearly, the price of a share generally is lower. That means it's more attractive for individual shareholders. And it is one way to modify profile of shareholder with the introduction of new individual shareholders. And this introduction, with more players, more buyers, has an impact, a positive impact on the price. It is also part of the communication policy. If you argue positively on the reason why you decide as a CFO to make an equity issue for free, you communicate positively on the firm and its financial policy. This is what is explained by signal theory, and we said a few words last time on the signal theory. So, these two effects, lower prices and higher liquidity, and signal theory are the explanation of value creation when you have an equity issue for free. So liquidity, volatility, equity for free, and signal theory, you have to take into account all these elements in your valuation calculations and policies. And you understand that many different elements of a financial policy will interfere in the value calculation, not only through the operational return on the asset side of the balance sheet. Now, a few words on synergies. Synergies are also very essential in valuation because many valuation calculation take place at the time of an acquisition, of a merger, and we see that in details with cases in the next course. So first point, it's what kind of synergies can we find? And we can argue around two distinctions. The first one is this distinction between positive and negative synergies. Positive synergies are those creating value. Negative synergies are destroying values. Positive synergies can be, as we see on the second line, reduction in costs, can be also increase in the level of sales. But you can find also negative synergies at the time of merger because both companies have very different culture, very different organization also, which are not compatible. Also teams which are different in terms of background, in terms of traditions, in terms of style of management, you know. And when at the time they have to merge, they are not able really to merge. And there is value destruction at that level. So synergies can be calculated and introduced in the value calculation, but they can be positive, and we expect them to be positive, but sometimes, you know, they are also negative. And the second point is that we have two categories of synergies: cost synergies and the sales synergies. What does it mean? For example, company A make an acquisition of a company B, you know, they are developing, they are producing and selling products which are not exactly the same, but which are compatible and which are supposed to be bought by the same kind of customer. Okay, and that means that you can find synergies in terms of costs because you can reduce the number of plants, because also the global inventory can be lower because parts of the raw materials are the same, and also because the production can be done in different countries with cost of production, wages, for example, which are lower. Sales synergies allow to sell for example, the product of company A in the country of company B using its distribution network. I mean, the distribution network is already paid, in fact. It's amortized. That means the distribution of the product of company A by the network company B will increase the cost, but it will be only marginal costs. So these costs will be limited. The increase in sales can be very large, and in that case, the margins are very high. So cost synergies and sales synergies, if they are both, you know, important, can bring high value creations. But in some cases, you know, you find negative synergies. When you hear, you know, 20 years after, part of the teams of a bank or a car production, I've got some examples of that, saying, oh, I'm working for a company called AB, but I'm assured I'm coming from company A, or I'm coming from company B. But the merger has never been a success. And I know that, for example, in France, for years, in BNP Paribas, you know, we had teams saying we are coming from Comptoir d'Escompte and some others coming from Banque du Crédit. And it was 6, 7, 10 years after the merger. So that means there was a problem in terms of management of the teams. The merger was not done, and in that case, we had negative synergies. this happened in several cases also in the car industry. Either, for example, for Daimler in the US, with US acquisitions, or it happened also for Japanese companies like Honda and in Western Europe. So if you have looked to reasons, these negative synergy are mainly problem of compatibility, of management, of structure, of style of management and decision processes. In terms of calculations, point 2, what do we need? We need the net present value of future synergies. It means what we do is to calculate in terms of cash flow, future cash flow, the impact year after year of these synergies. And when you get, for each of them, each category of synergy, the impact in terms of reduction of costs, increase in costs sometimes, sales synergies, positive and negative, you are able to make the calculation. You get the cash flow for each period in the future, and you calculate the net present value of the future synergies using a discount rate, which is the new WACC. It means the WACC of the new company resulting from the merger of company A and company B. This is not very easy for different reasons. The first one is that you have to identify clearly the synergies. You have to put a value on each synergy for each year. You have to be, second, very clear on the schedule when these synergies will appear. It could be very different if it happens immediately after the merger, the year after, or are extended, on a period of 3 or 4 years. And then you have also the calculation of the weighted average cost of capital, which is the new one of a company resulting from the merger, which has to be, has to take into account the new financial structure. And the new financial structure is not, in many cases, is not completely known at the time of the announcement of a merger. So you have also kind of instability at this level, which means you should make scenarios, sensitivity analysis. And as the identification and the measure of the potential synergy and the schedule are difficult to obtain, you need experts. And you find in the world consulting firms are not very big firms, but they are very specialized in the identification, calculation of future synergies, of the design of their schedule, their impact on the valuation process. This also means, that synergies are part of a price negotiation in any M&A operation. Synergies are what could be negotiated. I mean, you calculate the value of company A and company B, and very often we are not so far to agree between the seller and the buyer. But there's something which has to be negotiated. It is the increase in value of a new company resulting from the merger of A and B because of the synergy. And the synergies, generally, the value of synergies is split between the buyer and the seller. That means in order to split the synergies value, you need to identify and to measure these potential synergies to get a net present value of the future synergies. Potential synergies, you understand, are very often difficult to identify and to calculate, and it's also very often difficult to obtain them, to enforce them. After it means you have made the calculation, you have used an expert, you have introduced, you have taken into account the synergies impact in the valuation, in negotiated with the seller, if you have a bidder, the percentage of the synergy, or the value of the synergy you will accept to pay. And you agree on that. But after that, you have to manage the process. That means you become the owner of a second company or target, you merge with target, and you have to check that in the years to come, all the synergies identified and introduced into the calculations are obtained by the management teams. And this is very often something which is difficult because, it's not, it's a process which takes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. The teams are moving. The priority are not anymore this financial operation and the integration. And synergies which are supposed to be obtained after 3 or 4 years are very often difficult to obtain just because it's not central in the management problems of the new company. Other topics become more important. Some basic principle I want to come back here. Some basic principle. The first element is that the problem of all these costs you find on the financial resources and their position if you compare to the WACC. Remember always that I already said that, but I think it's quite important. The cost of equity of a firm, is always higher than its WACC. And the problem of explanation is very, very simple. It's just because the situation of a shareholder, the position of a shareholder is more risky than the situation, the position of a borrower. The legal background of the which is applied to a shareholder or to a borrower are different, and borrowers are more protected by the rules, legal environment than the shareholders. That means it has to be paid somewhere. To pay that, by an increase in the return. And the cost equity, remember, can be defined by a calculation. That's what we did in financial analysis. That's what we do in an example here today. But also, it is the minimum return that can be accepted by the shareholders. And of course, this minimum return introduces a premium for risk, which is higher than the premium on the debt level. So the cost of equity is always higher than the weighted average cost of capital. And remember also that if, I would say, in normal times, And when you have good arbitrage on the markets, short-term interest are always lower than medium-term low interest and long-term interest. Interest cost of debts are going up, when you extend the maturity of a loan. Okay. So that's the basic analysis or theory, which explain the shape of the interest rate curve. Remember what I did last time. The second point here is that we have, of course, the question of values and price. Values and price. In a valuation process, analysts, they obtain several values. They use different methods. They will use a method based on cash flows, another one on the dividends, third one using the leverage formula, a fourth one based on multiples, and so on. For each method, a different result. And the problem, of course, is that at the end, if you want to make a price offer, you need only one price. You don't need several values. That also means that you have, to move from several values to one price. So be very careful to that point, which is a very important question in economics and financial theory. It's not a new question at all. In some books, you will find something which is wrong, even in good textbooks. When the author says we have several values and want one price, the easiest way is to calculate the arithmetic values, the arithmetic average, of the different values. It means you find the values of 20, of 30, of 40, of 50, well, 4 values, you add the 4 values and you divide by 4. Arithmetic average. You don't know what to do. You have got several results, several data. You think that you can explain clearly the hypothesis behind and the method used, but there is no one which is better than the other. You just calculate the arithmetic average. But in financial terms, this is nonsense. What you do, and have a look at what's happened on the market when there is an IPO, for example. And this is a good example. When you calculate values, and these values seems to be accurate, what you do is to say all these values can be a price. And you put all these values on a straight line, and you obtain what we call a range. And this range is a segment, in fact, with extreme points, which are the low value and the higher value. That means the only thing you're able to say is that I've got several values, but all of them can become a price. I don't have any method to choose between them. I also think that, with the hypothesis behind, all the potential values which are included between the extreme points of the segments are feasible. Not only the values I've calculated. So even if the segment is not very large, for example, between 90 and 100, and you get values through your calculation which are 90, 100, 92, 94, 96. There's no reason why 95 is not a good value and a good price at the end. So what we say is that all the points between 90 and 100 are feasible. We have what we call a segment or a range of values. All of them are part of what is feasible. So the question is really how to make a choice. How to make a choice. And the choice is not a question of formula or average or weighted average or arithmetic average. It depends on two elements. And this is partly important when you have an IPO, when you have a privatization process, for example, or even for equity issues. The idea is that you have to take into account the situation on the markets, on the financial markets. What are they? Are the market bearish? Are they bullish? Are they somewhere between? High volatility, high liquidity? All these factors have to be taken into account. It is clear if the market is going up regularly, even if it is not completely bullish, if the volatility is low, if the liquidity is high, you will choose a price which is close to the upper value of your segment of your range. It means in the case I introduced with extreme points which are 90, 90, and 100, perhaps you can choose something like 98 or 99. If now you are on a bearish market, in most of the case, you will postpone your operation. But if you really need this operation, you will choose a low value. It means something like 90. So in the first case, your price, the price you choose at the time you issue the new shares or you introduce on the market by an IPO, the company will be close to 100. In the second one, it will be close to 90. The second element is the volume, demand from the potential buyer. If, of course, you want to issue 20,000 new shares and you understand that the demand will be something between 30,000 and 40,000, you can increase the price. If on the contrary, the demand is low, something like 8 to 10,000, even if the market is going up regularly, even if volatility is low, you will probably use a price which is lower, something like 92, 93, 94. So to find the price inside the range between the extreme points, the extreme values you have found which seems feasible, you have to take into account these two dimensions. What is the state of the financial market? Bearish, bullish, what about volatility? What about liquidity? And also, what about the mood of potential shareholders? What about their behavior? Are they ready to ask for new shares? Why? These two elements have to be taken into account to find, the price inside the range. So you understand that you have two different states. And very often, all these courses and calculations are only based on value calculation, application of models. So it's very useful and necessary to understand the models, to understand their the hypothesis behind, their bias. Mhm. But this is also as important, I would say, to understand that when you have several feasible values, you need one price. And it's not a question of calculation. It's not a question of application of a new model. It's not a question of weighted or arithmetic average. At that stage, you know that all the values which are in the range are feasible, and the elements to take into account will be elements on the state of the market and elements on the behavior of a potential buyer and shareholders. So you get two parts: value calculations and how to move from a range to a price. And at the end of the process, you need a price. If you say tomorrow morning I will be an IPO and share of my company in the market, that means that tomorrow before the markets open, you will be able to to launch a communique saying the price of my share will be this morning will be 97. And remember that at the end, in many large part of the financial operation, the price which is chosen is a decision. This is not a measure. It's a decision of the decision maker. And in most of the cases, the decision maker is a CFO. So CFOs have a very high and important responsibility in the determination of the price. Of course, this is based, on models. This is based on calculations. This is based on scenarios, sensitivity analysis, and so on. But, you don't obtain a price. You obtain values, several values. And CFO has to take into account these two dimensions, one, the state of the market and the behavior of a shareholder in order to find the price. And there is no formula for that. No formula. It's okay, but they are paid for that. That's true. The quality, one of the quality of the process, that kind of process of a good CFO is not the fact he knows 25 different models, he is able to make calculation and understand sensitivity analysis. Of course, this is a necessary condition to become a good CFO. But after that, he is mainly paid, to be able to make a choice between the different values, taking into account the other dimensions, which are difficult to measure. So values and price, that's a very central topic. So we need also terminal value in many calculations. All these calculations are based on net present value of future cash flows discounted at the present time, or future dividend forecasts, which are also discounted at the present time. You are not able, to make a calculation of a dividend, future dividends, future cash flow in 20 years. No. It depends very much on the firm, the industry, the economic sector. But when you get, 8 to 10 years calculation, which are feasible, it's already a very, very good situation in terms of analysis of the different scenarios. That means you need some kind of global data summarizing all the other cash flows, all the other dividends. all those which are not integrated, in the first in the scenario of the first 10 years. So we have terminal value and convergence processes, and this is what we see in one of the cases. A good proxy, is a proxy, is a calculation which is made, using, a clear formula. That's what I will explain later. So these were the first elements I wanted to show you here. Valuation, valuation is part of the financial topics, important financial topics, but you understand it is a kind of secondary level topic. It is based on elements you already learned, and you know now very well, like how to discount cash flows, like convergence processes, like also scenarios and sensitivity analysis processes. So you need all these techniques, a good knowledge of these techniques before moving to valuation. And that's the reason why, for example, in a program like MEBF, we don't teach valuation at the beginning. We teach valuation when you have taken several courses in finance, introducing all these tools and concepts. Another element I want to underline here is that we have specific difficulties in for some categories of companies. I'll give you some examples. First, a large number of you are working for banks, and the accounts of the banks are not exactly the same than the accounts of a non-financial company. That means parts of the calculations are different. And we will find specific elements, specific methods for the banks. The second element, in some cases, it's difficult to find, it doesn't exist, a benchmark, a comparable company. And this happens very often, in new economic sectors, those sectors growing very quickly with innovations, generally, which are very useful, of course. This could be the case in information systems, or could be the case again in the pharmaceutical sector. If you want to calculate, the value of a company like a biotechnology company, you calculate the value of Moderna today. It's very, very difficult to integrate the value of a new technology. They use ARM technology to produce the vaccine. If you want to calculate the value of the company specialized in payments like PayPal, or if you want to find the value for a company like Microsoft, it's very difficult to obtain. And that's happened for some of them at the time. These companies were listed on the stock market. And what you see in these cases where comparables are not available, right, is that we probably make mistakes in the calculation of a future price. And the consequence is that in the first days of the listing on the market, we have high volatility on the price. You have volatility at least for a few weeks before the markets progressively find a more stable situation, and the volatility is decreasing. Another difficulty we find, and we're trying to say a few words on later, is about the groups of firms. Many companies today are not, made of one company, one firm, which is very simple as a structure. But it's a kind of conglomerate, That means very often even the headquarters is not in the company with production and commercial activities. It is in a holding company, which is dealing only with strategic management, financial resources, acquisitions, international tax management, that kind of problem. And what you are interested in, of course, is not the value of the holding company. It is the value of the group as a whole. In terms of book value, you are not interested in the book value of the holding company, but the book value of the consolidated accounts, coming from the consolidated accounts of the group as a whole. And of course, you are interested by, for example, the WACC, which is the WACC of the group as a whole, not the WACC of the holding company. So we use the same tools, but in many cases it's quite difficult, particularly when these groups are made of companies which are very different. They are conglomerates with production firms, a bank, and sales companies, for example. So if you have a look to what's happened on these conglomerates in terms of values on the stock market, which is the easiest situation, you understand that there is a kind of undervaluation of these companies. And why do we have undervaluation? We have two explanations. The first one is because, in terms of calculation, it's a bit difficult to find value for group with companies inside. We have different payback for their investments, which are also different level of business risk, different financial structure. Okay. So you find a situation with potential mistakes, bias in the calculation, and this is taken into account by the price of the market by negative premium. And the second explanation, it's not coming from finance, but it's coming mainly from strategy. If you remember, your courses in strategy, you know that in strategy, one of the main messages is don't be with businesses in very different sectors. You cannot be good everywhere. You cannot be a good banker, a good producer of steel, and good in the food industry at the same time. You have to specialize. No. So the under specialization is taken into account in the valuation processes and in the price at the end by a negative percentage. And on the contrary, firms, even groups, which are concentrated in one kind of economic sector have a better value. It means the message of strategy courses and strategy models: don't be too diversified. Be concentrated on what you know. You cannot be a good manager in very different industries. Is taken into account in the evaluation process. You will understand that this is in contradiction with what we teach in finance, where we say, okay, diversify your portfolio. You will reduce your risk level. So we have two different, approaches. And it seems if you have a look to what's happened on the stock markets and consider the situation of a large number of groups which are listed, that the strategy approach is more taken into account than the financial one. It means the market doesn't understand or doesn't believe in the diversification strategy. The market believe more in the concentration, in the expertise in one field. And this has to be taken into account into the evaluation of groups, and particularly of groups that are kind of conglomerate, and which control subsidiaries in different economic sectors, from real estate to banks and from steel to food, for example. So these are also important elements to take into account. Okay. So this is what I wanted to present you first here, before we move to an exercise, which will allow us to come back to some points we have already studied, to connect them with evaluation processes, and to make also a few exercises and calculation. This is what I want to do. So this will start here at the level of slide number 9. I try to can find slide number 9. I don't know why it's not coming. Now we will see that it is easy calculation. It is here. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll go through these calculation together in order to apply and discuss part of the elements of evaluation calculations. You will see it's a simple exercise. Calculation of cost of debt, calculation of what? After taxes, before leasing, profitable case, non-profitable case, and you do the same with the financial lease included, with discussion on what kind of lease can be included into that calculation. And after that, we have the comparison of a case with an operational lease and a financial lease, and the impact of these two situations. And then we introduce the payout policy, means the dividend policy, and we calculate, with knowledge of the price earning ratio of the dividend, we calculate several data, and at the end, potential price of a share, which is in fact more value than the price here. Then I will introduce, something which is completely different, which is called a Gordon-Shapiro model. This is what I mentioned, saying we can also use the future flows. And we have two categories of future flows: cash flows, free cash flows. Remember what we said on the calculation of free cash flows in the preceding course. We can use also the dividends, but we need, of course, we need dividends calculation, dividend forecasts, And the problem is what to do with this dividend forecast on year N, as you see here. And hopefully there is some kind of convergence process I will explain. And then we come back on the main models, bring you some explanation, and conclude today with a few words on the two cases we use. The first one you know very well already, the biotechnology case, and the second one, which is this new case, on the signal, which I will introduce. So this is what we will do. My decision now is to make a short break. It's time for a short break before we move into this exercise. So we are here. We have finished with slide number 8, and we move to slide number 9. But before, let's have a 10-minute breaks, please. Thank you. Okay, so I think we can start again, always the second part of the first session. And you have a slide in front of you, which is called exercise 2. And the presentation here is a calculation. So that means we are in front of a company with a balance sheet on the right side, which is made of debt and of equity, of course. And the cost of debt here is calculated for the three categories of debt as usual. It means we start with long-term debts at the level of 2,000, medium-term debts as for 3,000, short-term debt for 3,000. Okay, and we know that which is the first problem to solve anyway. Long-term debts cost is 7% before taxes. Medium-term debts cost is 6%, and short-term debts cost is 4% after taxes also. Before taxes, excuse me. 7, 6, and 4 are before taxes. Okay. So very often it has already to be calculated. It means when you have, for example, medium-term debt, 3,000 multiplied by 6%, perhaps you have different loans or different bonds issues. Total is equal to 3,000, but the free interest of the loans, the free loans, are not equal to 6%. Perhaps it's for one of them it's 5.8, for another one it's 6.2, and for the other one is 6.1. So it's already a weighted average calculation of a cost of a different medium-term debts. So in most of the cases, these interests you find here for long-term and medium-term and short-term are already average cost calculations. So the long-term debts cost is easy to calculate, and 7% multiplied by 2,000, which is 140. For the second one, it's 3,000 multiplied by 6%, which is equal to 180. And last, it's 3,000 multiplied by 4%, which is equal to 120. So if you calculate simply the total cost of the debt is equal to 140%, 180% of 20, which is equal to 440. So at that point, it is quite easy. But we have, very classical categories of debt. We don't introduce, any of elements like options, like swaps, or flexible variable interest. Well, in the most simple case, we can find. And in that case, before taxes, again, the average cost of debt is 440 divided by the total level of debt, which is 3,000 plus 3,000 plus 2,000 equal to 8,000. And you get 440 divided by 8,000, which is equal to 5.5%. Average cost of debts before taxes is here 5.5%. Now, you should remember we have to take into account, and already said a few words on that, the fact the firm is profitable, not profitable. And of course, the cost of the debt will be different. And you understood in the preceding course that the interest, it's a kind of incentive for CFOs to finance by debt when they are profitable, and particularly if the tax rate is high tax rate, high profitability, you have better in terms of cost, at least, to finance your company using debt, even if, of course, it is also more risky, just because your debt equity ratio is increasing, which means the quality of the balance sheet is decreasing. If a firm is profitable here, real costs is 5.5% multiplied by 1 minus the tax rate. The hypothesis here is that the tax rate is 0.25, and this is equal to 4.125%. Okay, 5.5% multiplied by 1 minus 0.25, 25% being the tax. And the firm has two different costs of debt depending on the level of profitability and the level of taxes in the country. Here, with 25% tax rate, it is 4.125 and 5.5%. So this has to be integrated also into the calculation. Now, if we assume we will try to find a WACC after taxes and before leasing in the profitable case. So what does it mean? It means we have here, if you have a look to the second line, we have a company which is a company with three levels of debt, three categories of debt. Long-term, medium-term, and short-term for 2,000, 3,000, and 3,000. And a level of equity, total equity, of course, which is 12,000. So what you find here on the second line is 12,000 plus 2,000 plus 3,000 plus 3,000. If we assume, because we have other analysis, other calculations can be used, but the WACC is equal to 11%. This should be equal to 8,000, the total amount of debt multiplied by 4.125, which is a result of the preceding calculation after taxes. It means the average cost of debt. So the cost of debt in currency, it's dollar, in euro, is 8,000 multiplied by 4.125%. Plus, of course, the total level of equity, 12,000 multiplied by A being our variable here. This is what we are looking for. We are looking for the cost of equity using this formula. We're using this formula, including all the elements of the right side of the balance sheet. So line 3, you find that the total of the right side of the balance sheet, at least for financial elements, is equal to 20,000 multiplied by 11%, which is equal to 330, plus 12,000 multiplied by A, what we are looking for. And this is equal to 20,000 to 2,200. Now, what we want is to calculate A. So if we move to the third to the fourth line, we have 12,000 multiplied by A, which is the amount of total equity multiplied by the cost of equity we are looking for, which is equal to 2,200 minus the preceding elements, which means it is 1,900, which means the calculation at the end gives you something which is 15.83%. So we were able to calculate, 15.83%, the cost of equity for this company. But we are in one specific case. We are after taxes, yeah. We are before leasing, and we have made the hypothesis that the firm is profitable. Now we move to another case, no? Because of course you have several cases here. We are with the WACC after taxes, still the same situation. We include a financial lease here, and we are still in the profitable case. So the idea, which is simple, is that this financial lease is for 6,000, and the cost of this financial lease is 9%. So what we have cost, weighted average cost of capital before leasing contract in the profitable case and after taxes, which is 15.83. This is what we have calculated before. And you see that in part 3 here, second line, we have 20,000 multiplied by 15.83. Okay, but we add now 6,000 with a cost of 9%, and this is equal to 28,000, the new total of financial resources, 20 multiplied by B being cost we are looking for. So if we make the calculations, we find that in that case B, which is equal to 13.23%. The interest of this calculation is what? It's first to understand these two slides. Is to understand that, of course, we have an impact of a tax rate of on the cost of the financial resources, and we have an impact also of the profitability level of profitability. When a firm is profitable, the firm is profitable or not profitable, please. If the firm is profitable or not profitable, okay, the situation is different. When it is not profitable, there is no impact of the tax rate. When it is profitable, there is an impact of the tax rate. And of course, it is clear at the level of calculation of the cost of debt and the WACC, but it is true afterwards on the value of the firm. The second element is that the higher the tax rate, the higher the impact. And when you have profitability, which is very high for the firm, and a tax rate which is very high, the impact is very high. And the incentive behind is that with a profitable situation for the firm with a high tax rate, it's better in terms of cost calculation to finance the company using debt. If you consider other elements, like a measure of risk by the debt equity ratio, of course, the final decision could be different. Now, the second point is that, of course, we have this one. It's that we have, the introduction of other financial resources, and I want to introduce progressively different kinds of financial resources, which are not clearly, straight debt or classical equity made of new equity, ordinary shares, and retained earnings. And here I introduce a leasing contract, and later, it means next time, we will introduce in the calculations, what we call preferred shares, and also have a look to convertible bonds. So we are here, and I move to these elements, we know that the financial manager has signed an operational lease contract for 6k euros. Average cost is 9% after taxes. He asks you to calculate the cost of debt and the WACC after taxes after the signature. What will happen in the case of financial lease? So what we have made before the preceding calculations is that we have the financial lease, and we have included the financial lease into the calculation. And if you have a look to the principles, financial leases are taken into account in the balance sheets, the new system, the IFRS, and in the cost calculations. It means when you have a financial lease, it's supposed to be on a kind of specific legal and tax presentation of a debt contract. On the contrary, operational leases are not taken into account and are registered only in the income statement as in the traditional accounting system. So if you remember, traditional accounting system didn't integrate, in fact, the lease contracts in the balance sheets. They took into account only the monthly or yearly payment, total payment in the income statement. With the introduction of a new accounting rules, we have more economic presentation of the balance sheet, and we have split the analysis of the lease contracts into two categories: financial lease, finance a new lorry, for example, and operational lease. The first ones are integrated in the balance sheet in the cost calculation, and the second one are deducted on an annual basis on the income statement only. Okay. Point 3 here, this means that the above 6,000 euros lease, the last one, the first point here on the slide, is not taken into account in the calculations. And this is the difference with what we have seen, in the preceding case, where we had a financial lease, which is included into the calculation. Here it is not. So if it was a financial lease, the cost of debt after taxes will become 6,000 multiplied by 9%. Here it's 9, plus 8,000 multiplied by 4.125 equal 870 euros. And 870 euros divided by 9 plus 8,000, okay, divided by 17,000 is equal to 5.11%. So the cost of debt, is a function of a financial lease, is not a function of the operational lease. This is what you have to remember from these different calculations. For some firms, it's very important because, in some companies, particularly in the transportation sector, a large amount of lease contracts are used, and they allow in fact, a debt equity ratio which is very high, but at the same time, the cost of debt is very high. So why we have a situation? Generally because leasing contracts are more costly than debt contracts. So that means if you have high proportion, high percentage of leasing contracts in your financial resources, you have, compared to competitors financed by debt contracts, you have a high cost. And the second reason why we use leasing contracts, in spite of the fact leasing contracts have negative consequences, in fact, on the cost of debt and on the work, and on the value at the end, it is because, of course, they get more debt, higher debt or equivalent debt using leasing contract. That's classical straight debt contract, because the lender, the leasing company, I mean the bank behind, they are still the owner of the asset up to the end of the payments are included into the lease contracts. So, you know, this is something which is quite important in terms of financial policy, but it is also very important in terms of valuation because the costs are very different. Let's have a look to another point here. Let's have a look to another point. And you have some knowledge already on that. And this is useful to remember when you go into company valuation. The financial manager decides to increase the payout ratio from 20% to 30% of the total net earnings of child company. You remember what is a payout ratio? I already explained that. It means it is a percentage of a net earning or net earning per share distributed in dividend and dividend per share. And here, in that case, the payout ratio was 20%, and the payout ratio was increased, you know, and now it is 30%. This means an increase of a dividend from 3 euros to a higher amount per share to calculate. The CFO also knows that the average price earning ratio of a share of a company was 9 over the last 3 months. So this is quite interesting also because you understand there's a kind of bias in this approach. You had a 20% payout ratio, you move to a 30% payout ratio, we'll be able to calculate the new dividend, okay, and the impact of the decision. But anyway, the price earning which is used is not calculated at the time of decision, but it is an average to eliminate volatility, to reduce volatility taken into account. It is an average on a few weeks or months. Very often it is 3 months, and this is the case here. So you use at the same time in the model, basic model here, past data and present data. That means the financial environment, of course, is different. So the CFO asks you to calculate a proxy of the price of a share before and after his decision. Explain and discuss. You have 2 cases here. In the first case, with a payout POR, a payout ratio, which is equal to 0.2, the earning per share is equal to 3 divided by 0.2. Remember that 3 is the amount of dividend distributed, and 0.2 is the payout ratio. and it is equal to 15. Now, if you put it another way, of course, you find that the dividend itself, 3 euros, is a result of split of the earning per share between dividend, 20%, and 80% for retained earnings. So 3 divided by 22, which is equal to 15. And that means if we have 15 for the earning per share and 3 for the dividend, the retained earnings level is equal to the difference, 15 minus 3, which is equal to 12. Okay. In the second case, when we decide suddenly, because we want to attract more shareholders, or we are preparing, for example, an equity issues in 6 months or in 9 months from now, we decide to increase the payout ratios, and the payout ratios here, instead of being 20%, is now 30%. Okay. So in the short term, when you decide to increase or decrease the payout ratio, there is no impact on the earning per share. The earning per share is the level of the net earnings or net income you find in the accounting system divided by the number of shares. So it is constant. So you move the payout ratio, but you don't move, no consequence on the earning per share. And you get the dividend equal to 15 multiplied by 0.3, and you get 4.5. If you get 4.5 here for an earning per share of 15, that means the retained earnings, RE, is equal to 10.5. So in fact, what you have done, it's simply to modify the equilibrium between the retained earnings and the dividend distributed. Of course, shareholders are generally happy, say in general. I will come back on that part. And for the firm itself, it means less cash, and it means also lower increase in the level of total equity, because retained earnings, are moved after the decision to total equity part of the right side of the balance sheet. So that means that there's an impact also on the debt equity ratio, and that financial debt is constant here, and the total equity, of course, is moving, but it's moving up slowly, I would say, in the first case with 20% payout ratio, more quickly in the second case with just the contrary. The total equity is moving quickly up with a retained earnings of 12, and more slowly with a retained earnings of 10.5. And of course, the debt equity ratio is after this allocation of retained earnings total equity, the debt equity ratio is better in the first case with 20% payout ratio than in the second case with 30% net equity ratio. And this will have an impact on the valuation process. According to a simple model, there is no impact. The price is equal to the earning per share multiplied by the price earning ratio. It means it's not, there is no impact of the dividend policy, of the allocation of the earning per share between total equity and dividend distributed. In fact, you can argue that there is an impact, and the interesting part here is that can argue in two different directions. You will find models which are based on the dividend. And it means if you have a high dividend, you increase, and if the value of the company is based on the future future dividends discounted at the present time, you have an impact on the value. It means if you have 20%, payout ratio, which is the first case, okay, you get dividend equal to 3. Second case, you get a dividend equal to 4.5. It seems that the decision to increase the dividend has a positive consequence on the value of a company. So for the value process, to simplify, it's better to have a payout ratio of 30% than a payout ratio of 20%. This is what you will find when you apply dividend-based model, like what we'll see in a few minutes, Gordon-Shapiro model. If now you say, I think that on the contrary, there is a connection between the level of total equity, the debt equity ratio, and the value of the company. You understand that it is much better to have a 20% dividend policy than a 30% dividend policy, and that the first case is better than the second one. So you have to be very careful. You can find models when you compare them, which brings two different solutions. So a simple model is quite interesting, but it's only one view, one analysis. Doesn't take into account the problem of the distribution of dividend. Takes into account only the data coming from the accounting system and the multiple price earning ratio, which is measured for averages in the last few months. On the other hand, when you take into account the dividend, and you think that the value for the shareholder of the company is the dividend paid for the whole life, during the whole life of the company, an increase in the dividends seems to be very positive. So be very careful, and this is the reason why it is very useful to calculate different values using different methods, and after that to have a look and try to explain what's happened before moving further. It means moving to the range and also to the price calculation. Now what I introduce here is something which is different, but which is introduced by the preceding slide, which is models based on dividends. Do we find the same conclusion? No, I just explained that. And what is in fact point 2 here? What is the Gordon-Shapiro model? Gordon-Shapiro model says the price of a share. It means the price a potential buyer, potential new shareholder accept to pay today is equal to the dividend which has to be paid in the future, discounted to the present time. It means if you, let's put it that way, you want to calculate P0 Before the distribution of a dividend for this year, it will be equal to D0, the dividend distributed in 2021, plus D1, which is the dividend distributed in 2022, forecasted, it's a forecast, divided by 1 plus K, discount rate is K, plus D2, dividend to be distributed in year 2. It means here it's 2023, D0 was 2021, D1 2022, D2 2023, D3 2024, and so on. And the hypothesis is that, dividend will be distributed forever. But, we have different questions to solve. The first one is what should be here the discount rate? What should be the discount rate? You are not dealing with a decision of a CFO in front of the balance sheet of the firm. You are dealing with the cash belonging to the shareholder. And the cost, the discount rate used by shareholders is the minimum return they expect from an investment from a firm with a certain level of risk, belonging to a certain class of risk. So K is nothing else but the cost of equity. It means in all these models based on free cash flows, whatever they are, you will use the WACC. But in the golden Shapiro model and all the models based on dividend, you will use the cost of equity. The second problem here is with the dividend in the long term. We are not able to make the calculation. It's even very often difficult to make a good forecast of D3, D4, D5. But the N is 20, 30, 40 years. Nonsense. It's no possibility. So we have to find some way of convergence, what we call a convergence. So I will show you later in details, but how do we do that? How do we do that? We use, a regression approach, linear regression approach here. We use a linear regression approach, putting on the graph the past dividends, generally 5, 6 years, something like that, to get this sufficient number of data. And the forecast we were able to calculate, it means perhaps 5 or 6 years. It means very often, in that kind of graph, you get 5 data for the past years and 5 or 6 data for the years to come. And you put them taking into account, of course, the year where they are produced. And taking into account the year of production of these dividends and the level of the dividends for the 10 or 11 measures, you try to find the regression line. It means the better forecast of a trend. Better forecast of a trend. Okay. And what you are interested in, is 2 things. The first one is the slope of a line. Because the slope of a line is the long-term growth of a dividend policy, which eliminates the short-term differences. It is the trend. And this is what we're interested in. It's called G here. It's called G. Okay. Second, you try also, to measure the quality of a regression. Very often in finance, we use regressions in many processes, many measures. And we have to be very careful about the quality of a regression. And you probably remember that from your courses in statistics and quantitative methods. We are able to estimate very simply the quality of a regression line, a regression process and results. The first one, the first possibility is to calculate, the distance of each points, all these dividends, 10 or 11 points, to the straight line, which has been, estimated during the regression processes. And the total distance of the different points to a straight line should be minimum. If it is close to 0, that is a good regression. If it is very far from 0, it's a low quality regression. And probably, as you know, we can study the variance and the quality of this variance, which is the last element of a regression equation, is also one way to estimate the quality of a regression and of a trend and the slope and value G, of course. Okay. And when you have very limited variance, let's say this is a good process. You have found a good trend, and G will be very useful. After that, what we are able to demonstrate, I will not go through the demonstration, I will send you a reference on that, is that if we were able to calculate G using a regression process, we calculate the slope. Slope is G, we measure the quality of a process. If we are okay with the quality, okay, and we have value G, which is feasible, what we know is that we have what we call a convergence process. And this very complicated and difficult to use formula can be summarized into what you find on the third line of point 2, which is a very simple relation. P, price of share, is equal to D. Now, when I say D, in that case, it is D0, the first dividend to be paid, divided by K, the cost of equity, minus G, and G being, the slope of the regression line, and which is also the long-term growth rate of a dividend. This is the expected long-term growth rate of the dividend policy of a firm. There's an hypothesis behind, which is that K is always higher than G. K should be higher than G. But in that case, if it works, if the regression process is acceptable, demonstrates a good quality level, you get a formula which is very easy and simple to use. It is a formula like this one. P, price of share, means the value of the company will be P multiplied by N, number of shares, is equal to the next dividend to be paid. And generally, the next dividend, you get a good forecast or even the final decision, divided by K. And K, which is the cost of equity, as we will see, can be calculated using other models with several ways. And G can be calculated using the regression process I tried to explain just before. That means if you, in that kind of simple formula, if you know the value of 3 of these variables or parameters, you calculate easily the fourth one, the last one. If you are looking for the value of a company, which is our main problem here, you know that the value is equal to the price of a share multiplied by the number of shares. So you are looking for P. And if you know the next dividend to be paid, if you have calculated another way, the cost of equity, capital asset pricing model, leverage formula, for example. Okay? And if you have made a high quality, good quality regression, you know G also. So it's easy to find the price of a share and the value of a company. But you can use it also, this formula, another way. I mean, for example, in some cases, you have a firm which is listed on the market. You know the price of the share. You know immediately the market value of the company, multiplying the price you find on the market by the number of shares. And you know, or you have a good feasible forecast for the next dividend to be paid. You have calculated, already the cost of equity through capital asset pricing model, but you don't know what will be the growth rate in the long run for the dividend policy. So you calculate G using P, D, and K in the above inverse model. In our cases, it seems to be difficult for different reasons to calculate K, cost of equity, via our models, but you are able to calculate G through the regression processes I explained. You know the next value for D. Your company is listed on the market, you know P and the value of the company. So you are again able to calculate the last data, which is missing, which is K, the cost of equity in that case. So this is a very simple and relatively feasible formula, which can be used for finding different data, not taking into account the data which are already provided by other methods or measures. This is a very, very interesting model. And we will see later when this model can be used not only with dividends, which is the basis of the explanation by Professor Gordon and Professor Shapiro from Chicago University, Chicago Business School in the 60s, but it has been applied to cash flows. So we have different applications of this basic formula to cash flows, but also to other situations, like situation of groups of firms, as I mentioned before, and we'll see that later. One of the main problems, if you go to point 3 here, of course, when you use it, this is true for dividend, but also this is true also for cash flows. If you have very often you have difficulties to make good cash flow forecasts, which is the basis, of course, to calculate also dividends. Okay, so you understand that the quality of the cash flow forecast, and we show you this one on the Sanofi, is a very important element of the calculation. Quality of a cash flow forecast. whatever you do, you apply the same approach using cash flows and discounting cash flows, whatever is the cash flow you use, or you do that with an application on dividends, which is the basis, the original model, you need a good cash flow forecast before. Remember what I did in the last course. What was my presentation on cash flow forecast? And we will apply that to Sanofi case later. Another point which is quite important, and this is a question mark, is the stability of discount rate in the future. You see, for example, in the formula point 2 here, the Gordon-Shapiro model. At the end, we use or we obtained the same value for K through the years. Is it feasible? It means, that even if the policy of the firm is identical in the years to come compared to what is right now, you have the environment, economic and financial environment, which is moving over time. And of course, this is not taken into account. So the value of K you use or the value of K you obtain is a kind of average, which is the best calculations you can do. But it is clear that the value of K you use is a value of K which will not be perhaps even acceptable if 4 or 5 years from now, because the financial environment conditions will have moved. So this problem of discount rate in the future, the quality of valuation, the stability of K over time is a clear problem. Last point here, but I already said that it's not a financial element as well. It's a mathematical element. Those of you familiar with convergence of series, know that K minus G in that kind of formula should be always positive. In financial terms, it means the cost of equity should be higher, than G, which is the long-term growth rate of a dividend. We need this relation to have a convergence process for the complex formula, which is on point 2, the basic and original Gordon-Shapiro model. We will find Gordon-Shapiro several times, with different applications, It's a model which is very often used and applied. Now, if you move just to this slide number 14, slide number 14, if you summarize what we have said up to now in terms of model, you understand that even though we didn't introduce the details of some of them, I already wrote the name of these models. We have called a simple model. And the simple model, is this model with which is a relation between the price of a share, the earning per share, and the price earning. We had the discussion on that. We know that the equality is to be simple, but we know also that it could be in contradiction with results obtained by some other models, which is one of the weaknesses of the situation. Second, we can have book value models. They are assets based mainly. You take the sets, you deduct that level, and you find the value. Can be used for very small companies, some specific cases. But anyway, for growing companies and in a world with inflation, it gives you values which are far from the real value. No inflation, stability, nearly no growth, and they can be used. A growth economic sector, growing company, some inflation, and the real values are very far from those given by book value models. Third one, multiple base models. We'll come several times on that. All these models, using benchmarks, using comparables, and using also in the income statement, mainly three margins. The first one being the EBITDA, the second one being the EBIT, and the third one being the net income or net earnings. I said a few words on the difficulties to applying these models, because we need comparables, and it's not very often easy to find comparables, and we have these problems, for example, of liquidity, which have to be taken into account if you references the benchmark comparables. Company listed on the stock market and the company to value is not listed. We have all these categories of future flow models with two main basic approaches. The first one, which is based on free cash flows, and the second one, which is based on dividends. So you know what is the basic of this calculation, because we went through in the investment course through many analysis of the discounted cash flow calculation of an NPV and so on. But now it's a bit different. We have to take into account, for example, the situation of firms in terms of leverage, and to introduce a situation of companies with a group of firms and not only one firm. And for future flow models, dividend case, which is golden GP1, we know that we are very lucky with this process of convergence, but that convergence is obtained only with a condition, which is a K minus G positive, the cost of equity being higher anytime than the long-term growth rate of the dividend. But we have also a few weaknesses. The problem of quality evaluation, for example, the stability of the cost of equity in the long run, which is also a question mark. So we have also a few weaknesses. And the last one I didn't introduce here, but you know that because I went through the presentation of the graph and the calculations in the preceding course, which is the leverage formula. Because the leverage formula allows you to calculate many elements. It's a bit like the dividend model based on the Shapiro approach. When you know all the parameters and variables but one, you are able to calculate the last one. It means here, for example, you are able to calculate the return on operations. You are able to calculate the cost of equity. You are able also to calculate an optimal net equity ratio and policy of debt. If you have a good proxy or good knowledge of the elements of the calculation, the cost of debt, we are marking the cost of debt, but also the return of your portfolio of investment, the RE, the formula, if you remember, same kind of approach. But anyway, one of the elements when you have a look to all these series of models is that you can connect these models. They can be connected. Just one or two elements of explanation. For example, if you start here with the dividend-based 0.5 golden Shapiro model, okay, and you want to calculate at the same time, you have a model which is P equals to D divided by K minus G. You know D. You know D being the next dividend to be paid. You know P because the company is listed on the market. But you don't know K and you don't know G. It means you need a third element to calculate the fourth one. You know P because the firm is listed on the market. You know the next dividend because there is a clear dividend policy which is explained by the management, by CFO. But you don't know G, the long-term growth rate of a dividend, and you don't know also K, the cost of equity. And you think that probably there is some way to find one of these elements in order to calculate the last one. Our first possibility is what we did, is to calculate G, the long-term growth rate, through a regression process. But there is a second one, and very often it's easier. It's to calculate from outside, the cost of equity. And the cost of equity can be calculated with two different approaches. The first one is the leverage model, 0.6, but also, which is generally the easiest one, which is the capital asset pricing model. Because the capital asset pricing model incorporates, the risk-free rate, take into account also the beta company. If a company is listed, this was my hypothesis here. Generally, it's quite easy to calculate the beta, even if the beta show the same problem, than the price earning. It means it's calculated on the past, an average calculated on the past. And if you want to calculate the expected return of the market, you have a look to the expected return of the largest and more diversified index on the market using future positions. So, capital risk and pricing model, with the knowledge of these different elements, allow you to calculate the cost of equity. So you can connect the capital asset pricing model or the leverage model to the Gordon Shapiro model, bringing into that model the cost of equity. And in that case, D, P, and K, it's easy, of course, to calculate G, the last data, which is missing. So these models are really connected one with the other. Even the simple model, I use simple model, you have good knowledge of the two right side element, the earning per share. You have a good accounting system, it is feasible, relatively stable. You know the price earning through an analysis of the past price earning on the stock market. Even if it is not yours, you can use PE coming from comparables, which give you a value of P. And P, of course, can be used, for example, in a Gordon Shapiro model to bring P from the simple model into the Gordon Shapiro model, and you need another two elements to calculate the last one. If you calculate next dividend, generally it is the case, you need again, and you are back to the problem I just studied a few minutes ago, you have to find either G through the regression, or you have to find K through another approach, another model, for example, a capital asset pricing model. So all these models are connected one with the other, and they have to be used jointly if you want to move into these models. So I will rather quickly through different important points here. I would say on two main elements. The first one is the connection between values and price. Price is never arithmetical, weighted average of values calculated by different methods. I'm trying to explain that very clearly, and if it's not, I will come back on that point later. It's one the next session. And in all these elements, you have to remember that you have to take into account the liquidity, the volatility, the behavior of a shareholder, for example. Many other elements which are not in the basic models. So you have basic models, and you have to integrate more elements in order to get good valuation processes. The second element, just what I showed you, we have different models. And those models can be connected one way or another. And to use them properly, we have to connect them. It allows to improve the quality of the results. Last point, last slides here. It will be very short. We have two applications in terms of cases. The first one is a very classical biotechnology case. I will add some more elements, but anyway, you already know that case, and you are able to make calculation analysis using cash flows forecasts and using dividend forecasts. You have a good knowledge also of the elements which are useful in the capital asset pricing model if you need a cost of equity. Because if you have a look to Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2, you will remember that you have got the risk-free rate. You have got also the expected return of the market. And you have also a calculation result of the beta of the company. So if you start with these elements, you are able, to develop part of your approaches which are mentioned above. At least if I come back here, simple model, book value methods, multiple base models, future flows, dividends and free cash flows. Leverage model will be a bit more difficult. I have to give you to bring you some more data, but you are able to do that. And of course, this is what we will do with the other elements that we bring you, which allows you to make sensitivity analysis. The second one will be this second case I will introduce progressively, which is a case with other financial resources like with a chance, but also the discussion on how to take into account several elements in all these calculations. Do we have to use the book values or the market values? So what are the differences in terms of results? So you will have that kind of elements. You have also the introduction of leasing. So this is a very good case for that. No, the signal case. And I will introduce the calculations and we'll give you some more data to go further into the sensitivity analysis and scenarios design. So this is just what I wanted to do today. It's an introduction to company evaluation. We went through several main topics after the presentation of the syllabus and of course who, why, and is doing is going through valuation calculations, the main families, a few specific points, liquidity, volatility, basic principles, possibly this relation between values and price. Came back to calculations with Charles Company, underlining the importance also of the profitable and non-profitable situation, the impact of financial resources more complex than traditional equity and straight bonds. Here it is leasing contracts, but we see preferred shares, convertible bonds. What are the consequences in terms of values? Went back to simple model and then to the golden Shapiro model before presenting and discussing a slide with the main categories of models, showing their the difficulties, and showing also the connections which are strength of these models. That's just what I wanted to do with you today with these slides, and we will meet again tomorrow. I will go into more details and I will introduce some elements for your assignments and your final exam tomorrow. So thank you very much for this first course. I wish you a good night and take care. And I hope that if circumstances becomes better in the months to come, we'll be able to meet in Vietnam, in Hanoi, in Ho Chi Minh City, before the end of the program. Thank you, good night, and see you tomorrow. Goodbye.